The Pathways Through to Space, Franklin Merrell Wolff, Sleep and Death. It is a common experience among those who have attained the realization to find that the fear of death passes. In my own case, for some time, death has possessed more than value of an interesting adventure than of something to be feared, save in the sense of dreading physical pain that might be connected with the process. In fact, heretofore I have had to put forth an effort to resist a desire for death in the physical sense, not because of a great personal pain in this life, but for the reason that I sensed very clearly that physical embodiment acts like a brake on consciousness, so that death is in some measure a kind of liberation for all men, save in the case of some very low types. But recognition has brought to me a reconciliation with life in the world field, or in other words, it has brought me to a point where I willingly accept a break since I see that it serves a useful purpose. In addition, I know that release will come in its own time when the particular work here is finished, and thus all that is required is to be faithful to a duty which will not be of unreasonable duration. So actually, I'm more concerned now with the well-being of the physical personality than at any time previously. But my concern for it is like the artisan's care for a useful tool, plus a certain feeling that it is meet to do justice to the child, the personality. But so far as death itself is concerned, I find it quite devoid of grave dramatic significance, for I realize clearly that what we commonly call death is but a shifting in the modes of life or consciousness, and most emphatically not a terminus. I cannot say that I feel any personal yearning for immortality, as I am attracted rather by the bliss of pure impersonal consciousness. However, I do accept the responsibilities of indefinitely continued individuality, as I realize that there are very important reasons for doing so. Thus, today I stand in this position. I know that in the real sense, there is no death or birth, that in the individual sense, I can maintain continuation indefinitely. And finally, that physical death is merely a passing incident which affects but a transformation in the mode under which consciousness manifests. In all this, there is no room for any real fear. In a profound sense, I have already died, though the body still persists, and I did not have a hard time in the essential dying. The organism very soon acquired more from the transition than it lost, and it is now clearly becoming stronger. But it is a fact that I cannot too strongly emphasize that the essence of dying is not the dissolution of the physical body. Fundamentally, it is a change of level of percipience and appercipience. Now we come to a point of a very highest practical importance. If a man, while embodied, has not learned to integrate consciously the embodied with the disembodied levels of percipience, then so far as physical consciousness is concerned, death involves entering a state like a dreamless sleep. In the higher sense, it is not an unconscious state, but it is unconscious for the personal man, except that he may experience a sort of dreaming consciousness apparently constructed along the formal lines of his embodied experience. Let the reader keep it well in mind that this is not a matter of an arbitrary or imaginative estatology, but rather of a necessity that must be clear from the purely epistemological considerations. The point simply is, if a conscious being has integrated self-consciousness in a given kind of complex mode, such as the five-sense perceptive consciousness of man, and if it is familiar with no other mode of consciousness, then if it is suddenly severed from that mode and thrust into one utterly different, no matter how bright the light of the latter may be, it will seem to this being as unconsciousness. After a time, self-consciousness may awaken to function in the new mode, and there will be no basis for recognizing the new entity as being the same individual who experienced in terms of the former mode. This is radical interruption of the continuity of self-consciousness, and while in the higher or spiritual sense consciousness per se has not ceased, yet the individual as individual has proved to be no more than a mortal being. Actually, nature guarantees man no more than this, but he may, by his own self-induced effort and by the aid of awakened men, achieve continuity of self-consciousness or individualized consciousness. This is acquired or conditional immortality and constitutes an important part of the significance of cosmic consciousness. The crux of the whole problem in achieving individualized immortality is the learning to integrate while still embodied the outer and inner levels of percipience. This is, in fact, the mystic process symbolized by the squaring of the circle. The relationship between the square and the circle is incommensurable, and this means that circular relationships or values are not comprehensible in square terms. Embodied man is a square while the inner man is a circle. The mass of human beings shift from level to level through unconsciousness, and thus in these cases the one level is to the other like dreamless sleep. The two states are discrete instead of continuous, and therefore we are faced with the condition where we have, as it were, two distinct men instead of one self-conscious being. The circle is birthless and deathless and consequently immortal, but the square is generated in time and in course of time subject to dissolution. But by squaring the circle, and more correctly by circularizing the square, the latter kind of consciousness is taken up and blended with the immortal consciousness of the circle. This gives to the individual consciousness immortality. It should be clear that the cross-transference in sleep or during the trance state is not enough. Man must win the power to be awake here and there at the same time. Once he has done this, even though the cross-correlation were achieved for but one moment in a given lifetime, he has mastered death and is immortal in the acquired sense. Now, when a man has succeeded in circularizing the square, he has shifted his center of self-identity to the circle and thus has really died while remaining in the physical body. Consequently, while moving in the world, he has become one who is not of the world. There is a field of tensions or a gulf between the domain of the circle and the square. This is sometimes spoken of as a zone of clouds or intervening sea. Some, in crossing this field of tensions with a partial holding of self-consciousness, report a sense of whirling which may produce an effect like dizziness. It is possible to hold the correlation steady without the whirling effect. But for my part, I do find a tension that tends towards something like dizziness, which, however, may be controlled. But this does require the effort of a close, though subtle, concentration. I would say that the effort required for the individual parallels very closely certain demands made upon the imagination in higher mathematics. In fact, the man who has been able to comprehend rational, irrational, and imaginary numbers as one integrated and real manifold, and not merely as an arbitrary creation of pragmatic value alone, has mastered the knack of conscious cross-correlation between the domain of the circle and that of the square. However, this is not the only way, but simply the one with which I, personally, am most familiar. As previously noted, the transition may be greatly facilitated by the process of induction. Those men who have not mastered cross-correlation while still embodied go into a state of essential sleep after death. Sooner or later, they have a kind of experience in a dreamlike consciousness, and this state constitutes the ordinary heaven worlds. And when they are of better sort, the dream is a continuation of the consciousness in the subject-object sense, but in the heavenly worlds, the quality is entirely blissful. There is practically no opportunity for the exercise of discrimination in such states. It is the contrast of pain and joy united with their appropriate causes that tends to shock the dreaming consciousness into wakefulness. This contrasting condition is found in ordinary earth life and thus constitutes an important part of the reason why the vital or determinative steps can be taken only here. Dreaminess is the great barrier. But most of the human consciousness, even in the world, is in a sort of waking dreaming or somnambulistic state. However, we have here instruments that can shock to wakefulness, while such is not the case in after-death states of the ordinary individual. Unquestionably, pain is one of the very greatest of these instruments, and thus is much less an evil than a beneficent agent. The more I have studied the problem, the more I have become convinced that it has been a great mistake to concentrate so much attention on evil. The real difficulty is the almost universal somnambulism in which men pass the bulk of their lives, some spending many lives without leaving that state at all. It is, in effect, an hypnotic sleep. And the real problem of religion is not the saving of human souls from evil, but a dehypnotizing of the mind. An excellent opportunity for studying the fundamental nature of ordinary death is afforded in the phenomena of familiar waking and sleeping states. A man goes to sleep to be active in dreams, or occasionally to enter the dreamless state. Ordinarily, while dreaming, the man does not know that he has gone to sleep. That means that he has not mastered the cross-correlation self-consciously, and in this case he has the foretaste of what happens in ordinary death. But it is possible to dream and know that one is dreaming at the same time, holding in mind a memory of the waking state. In this case, self-consciousness has made the correlation. Now, to have done this once in a lifetime is sufficient to supply a means whereby the after-death state of dream can be broken by a man who has departed from his physical body. It is most certainly a definite step towards recognition. So the student would do well to study carefully all of the phenomena connected with sleeping and waking. It is even possible to go to sleep and later wake up without there having a break in the continuity of self-consciousness. In such an instance, the body does go to sleep and consciousness ceases to function on the physical plane, but it remains active on other levels with the continuity of self-consciousness remaining unbroken. It is, in addition, possible to correlate at least some measure of the inner state with the brain mind so that the outer memory will return something. But this memory is not the essential mark of the continuity of self-consciousness. The dream state is so important that something more should be said concerning its nature. Just as it is true that man can be essentially dreaming while active in the physical body, the most life here is in this state. It is likewise true that some of the states entered while the body sleeps are far more truly waking states than any which are possible while in the physical body. The experiencing of these states with most men is very rare, but they do occur more or less frequently with some individuals. They have certain noble earmarks. The most important of these is the effect they have on the waking life. They may enrich, deepen, or give new direction to the outer life. They tend toward an increase of genuine rationality. These are the adumbrations of the real life. In contrast, the dream state casts a glamour, which may be painful or pleasant, but in any case tends to produce a drug-like effect, both upon the will and the reason. In addition to drugs, the light of the moon often produces a somewhat similar effect. The hypnotic state is a dream state par excellence. This consciousness has the property of possessing a man instead of individual possessing and commanding it. It tends to lead him away from the decisions made in light of clear and discriminating judgment. It is very characteristic of consciousness found in psychological crowds and affords the reason why control of crowd consciousness is effected most successfully by psychological devices rather than by appeal to rational judgment. Dream consciousness characteristically has a quality which may be called blurred or smudged. It is quite lacking in crystalline sharpness or the quality of precision. The logical capacity is weak in dreaming state. There is also a lack of firmness of will. The dreamer floats along in his consciousness instead of being an achiever in it. He may dream in terms of ideality, beauty, and be highly freed from the gross and the sensual, but the dreamer as such lacks character and strength. On the whole, his equipment is peculiarly poor for breaking from bondage to subject-object consciousness. He may be a good man and earn long periods of dream-like bliss, but all this is less than the liberated state. So all in all, it should be quite obvious that for him who would attain the higher consciousness, one of the first necessities is the mastering of the dreaming tendencies. To effect this mastery, there are several useful disciplines that can be devised, all of which cultivate the qualities that are opposite of the dreamlike consciousness. Thus, all activities that acquire strong positive and incisive use of the mind and all will-directed efforts, particularly in the direction that are more or less distasteful, are highly helpful. Strong intellectuality affords one of the best resistances to the dreamlike states. Its danger is that it may develop egoism to such a degree that it becomes a serious barrier. But my judgment would be that it is easier to master an overly developed egoism, for here we have a strength to work with, than it is to build the necessary strength in two dreamy consciousnesses. So I should place somnambulism rather than egoism and evil as the first among the problems that must be mastered in this humanity if it is to progress towards liberation.